spoke to women in gun clubs and so on who said, I've been attacked 4 times in the space of a year. I want to be able to defend myself.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
And the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says the death toll in Gaza is now more than 60,000 people since the start of the war.
I'm Roland and this is Battle Lines. It's Friday, the 26th of September 2025. This weekend, Moldovans go to the polls for what might be the most important parliamentary election in the country's history, and Russia seems bent on fixing the result. But first, Jair Bolsonaro was dubbed the Trump of the Tropics when he stormed to power as the populist, anti-establishment and conservative president of Brazil in 2019. When he lost power in 2023, though, he challenged the legitimacy of the election, and now he's been convicted and sentenced to 27 years in prison for plotting a coup. What has become of Jair Bolsonaro? Is this the end of the Brazilian experiment in populism, or are rifts in Brazilian society as wide as ever? And what are the lessons for the many other democracies around the world grappling with political polarization? The British press is sometimes guilty of neglecting South America, but the Telegraph recently dispatched Adrian Blomfield to Brazil in an attempt to answer all those questions. I began by asking him to describe Jair Bolsonaro's career and how he ended up in jail.
There was an insurrection like the storming of the Capitol after Donald Trump left office. In fact, it followed almost exactly 2 years later, in which Mr. Bolsonaro's supporters stormed the 3 main offices of the state in the capital, Brasilia: the Supreme Court, Parliament, and the presidency. They smashed things up, destroyed artifacts, defecated on the floor, and for 6 hours ran riot. There were claims that Mr. Bolsonaro had instigated this. There was an investigation that then turned up a lot more astonishing claims, including a plot to bring in the military to kill Lula, who had won the election, and his running mate, as well as the judge who had been Supreme Court judge who'd been investigating Mr. Bolsonaro. And then on the 11th of September, after a long trial, it reached its climax, and Mr. Bolsonaro and 7 of his top aides were found guilty, and Mr. Bolsonaro was sentenced to 27 years. He's not in prison. He's under house arrest. He was already under house arrest under the laws that actually led to Lula being freed from prison. He can remain under house arrest until his avenues of appeal, which are fairly limited in his case because he was tried by the Supreme Court, are exhausted. So it's possible that we see Bolsonaro behind bars in the coming months.
And just to be specific, he's 27 years. What was the charge? What was he convicted of?
So there are a series of charges, but it's essentially about plotting a coup to stay in power. So he instigated this insurrection, but then there was this whole plot that emerged. It's quite an astonishing series of allegations that was presented, but essentially that there was a plan called Green and Yellow Dagger. That's after the colours of the Brazilian flag, in which the leaders of the armed forces, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, were approached by aides of Bolsonaro and asked to support a coup. The claim was the election has been stolen from Mr. Bolsonaro. That at the same time there were plans to, as I say, kill particularly those 3. There were talks of either poisoning Lula or using explosives or some other form. There was allegedly a plot to kill this very famous judge who presided over the investigation of this case, which is one of the things that led to a claim of conflict of interest, Alexander de Moraes. That appeared to have collapsed. They sort of followed the judge home, but then lost him, failed to carry out the assassination, the plot fizzled. The heads of the army and the air force refused to have anything to do with it. The head of the navy offered his forces for a coup. According to the prosecution, he was tried alongside Mr. Bolsonaro and also found guilty.
Yeah, all of that's completely extraordinary. So all of that came out in court. The Brazilian Supreme Court is satisfied that it's been proven, hence they're in jail. A simple question, really. How's that going down on the Brazilian street?
Whether this is the end of Bolsonaro's career, I don't know. I mean, he's 70. There's talk of his supporters in Congress are pushing for an amnesty. Brazil, we have to remember, emerged from military dictatorship in 1985. And since the collapse of the monarchy in the late 19th century, there have been 14 or 15 coups and attempted coups, all of which have resulted in amnesty. So one of the things that is being held up is that for the first time, someone who has mounted a coup or attempted coup is being held to account for their actions. And this is a sign of the robustness of Brazilian democracy. So that's one side of the debate. But there are others who say that Bolsonaro is the victim of a left-wing witch hunt, that the Supreme Court itself has been captured by the left-wing establishment, that this investigative judge, de Moraes, he oversaw the prosecution, he was a judge, he was also allegedly the victim of the crime. Does that make sense? 2 of the other judges were appointed. There were 5 judges on the panel. 2 of the other judges were appointed by President Lula. The 11 judges on the Supreme Court are political appointees, so there are always going to be those questions. But there are questions of process, and it has gone beyond Brazil's borders. We saw a last-minute intervention by Donald Trump in defense of his friend. He said that Bolsonaro was the victim of a witch hunt, and he took various measures against Brazil, plunging relations between 2 very important countries, the 2 largest in terms of population countries in the Americas who have historic ties. 50% tariffs he imposed on Brazilian imports, or at least on many Brazilian imports. That's the second, or the joint highest in the world with India. And he also imposed sanctions on the judges, and Magnitsky sanctions in particular, on Alexandre de Moraes. The Magnitsky Act was famously brought in to punish violators of human rights, first initially in Russia for those responsible for the beating to death of a Russian lawyer in custody. It's the first time it's really been used in a case like this, so it's been seen as quite politicized. And actually, in the last couple of days, those sanctions have been extended to Alexandre de Moraes' wife. So we saw this sort of last-minute, quite robust, muscular lobbying by the Trump administration, which failed to achieve what it intended to do, and actually perversely increase the popularity of President Lula. There's an election next year. It's unclear whether Lula will stand in that, but like we've seen elsewhere in the world, when you're in Donald Trump's sights, it can do wonders for your domestic political reputation.
Indeed. I'm wondering if this is the end of Brazil's experiment with populism, or just a cycle of it. And in a way, whether that has lessons or implications for other countries who have gone through the same kind of polarization. And you've just got back from there. You've been speaking to a lot of Brazilians on both sides of the kind of political divide. Could you lay out the nature of the divide, of the polarization in Brazil's case? Who ended up supporting Bolsonaro? Who went the other way? And do you think that that country, in a way, has put that period of division behind it in a way that the rest of us perhaps haven't?
I think in a short answer, no. Bolsonaro may be gone. He may not be gone. I don't think Bolsonarism is dead. I think the country remains polarized, a 50-50 country like we've seen in so many parts of the world. And I think they're fascinating lessons to look at, because we've seen Brazil if we look at where the UK is, going through a period of populist rule, which we may see in the UK, coming out the other side, and still not answering the questions that led to its rise in the first place. So if we look at Brazil, the three key constituents for Bolsonaro can be divided into what are known as Bible, beef, and bullets. I'll quickly run through those. I think those are more manifestations of the issue, but Bible comes down to the evangelical Protestants in Brazil. So evangelical Protestantism is on the march. So according to projections, sometime in the next decade, there will be more evangelical Protestants in Brazil than there will be Roman Catholics. And they are a formidable political constituency because unlike Roman Catholics, who are often similarly conservative in outlook, they're very organized politically. And some of the right-hand people of Jair Bolsonaro are members, they're televangelists, most notably Silas Malafaia, who is one of the people that I spoke to, chief principal advisor. They represent traditional Brazilian values, and they've really risen because of the culture wars.
What on earth is driving that? I mean, you've just completely reshaped my preconception of Brazil as a very Catholic country.
Yeah, well, Malafaia, ironically, he's been on the scene. He once endorsed Lula. So the evangelical church has filled a key gap in Brazil, particularly among poorer Brazilians who've been left behind in a very divided state. There's a huge income disparity. 1% of the country controls 30% of the wealth. So there is this huge gap in wealth. And I went to some of these evangelical churches while I was in Brazil, and you could see poor people coming in. These are poorer areas of Sao Paulo, but this is experienced across the country. And they're given dignity by the church. They're told that God will answer their problems. They feel heard. We saw people weeping. We saw people rejoicing. There was an incredible impact that has been had that, and people we spoke to said that they didn't feel that they got that kind of support from the state. And they didn't feel that they got it from the Catholic Church, which is one of the reasons why people have moved towards the evangelical church. That and the prosperity gospel, because there is this key fact. I don't know if you're familiar with the prosperity gospel, but Roman Catholicism and traditional forms of Christianity essentially say that you will be rewarded for your suffering here on earth in the next life. But the prosperity gospel, which is at the heart of this kind of evangelical movement, says you can be blessed now. And we spoke a lot about this to Mr. Malafaia, who says it's not just about getting riches now, but there is this belief if you give money to the church, you will become richer sometime before you die, but that you will also benefit. Then it plays into the traditional things that we're familiar with in the culture wars. So Bolsonaro stands against wokery, and that takes a slightly different form in Brazil. So he's very anti-abortion. His wife, Michelle Bolsonaro, who we interviewed this week and could be a potential successor, is a born-again evangelical. That's one of the reasons why he came into this. And Bolsonaro, who was a Catholic, has become an evangelical as well. He was baptized in the waters of the Jordan River, I think, in 2016. And when you see the Bolsonaro protests that have been taking place in city streets in Brazil, you'll see people holding the American flag, the Israeli flag, and the Brazilian flag, because it's all tied up. And I won't go into all of the details about that, but essentially abortion is a key issue. LGBTQ stuff is a key issue, and the sanctity of the family, the traditional family values, which the right in Brazil believes that President Lula and the left have attacked.
Right. The next one you said was beef.
So beef is the agribusiness sector, which is very powerful. Brazil is obviously a very, very large country. It's larger than the contiguous United States. Farmers are powerful, but they have been threatened by two things in particular. One, indigenous land rights. So the left in Brazil has, for both environmental reasons and to support the indigenous community in Brazil, tried to protect certain land on which Brazilian farmers would like to plant. And farmers also blame welfare politics, which is another key issue here, for a lack of labour. They cannot get cheap seasonal labour anymore, and they say that's because of Lula's policies of creating a welfare state in which people are allowed to have benefits. And so that's a key look at, okay, Brazilians have become lazy because they're dependent on handouts from the state. We can address all of that if there's time. And then we have bullets, and that's all to do with the state of crime in Brazil, which has been chronic in the favelas, as I think everybody knows. There's lots of gun violence. There's lots of petty crime, mobile phones being snatched, muggings. And Bolsonaro defended gun rights, essentially, because people want to protect themselves on that particular lobby. They also defend the police. So Bolsonaro wanted to strengthen the police and give them more opportunities to shoot dead offenders. The left disagrees because before Bolsonaro came to power, the police in Brazil were already shooting dead 4,000 suspected criminals a year. You compare that to the US, where it's 1,000. Since Bolsonaro came to power, that number then rose to 6,000. So the question is, does that actually affect crime? But nonetheless, we spoke to women in gun clubs and so on who said, I've been attacked 4 times in the space of a year. I want to be able to defend myself. So there was support for Bolsonaro on those things. My feeling is that while those are the 3 core constituents that Bolsonaro has identified, there are broader issues. So people seize on one issue and say, this is what's wrong with Brazil. Bolsonaro will answer it because, in his fiery way, he spoke to all of those particular constituents. But I think there are 2 key things at play. First of all, there was a famous Economist cover in 2009, Brazil lifts off.
Oh, this is with the
with Christ the Redeemer.
Christ the Redeemer taking off like a rocket.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Brazil, it was an extraordinary transformation. Partly down to Lula's first presidency, in which, although he was a trade unionist of the left, he pursued orthodox economies that brought down inflation, that had a sensible monetary aspect to them. And, of course, the commodity boom driven by Chinese demand, particularly for soya and agricultural goods. And according to projections at the time The Economist wrote that story, Brazil was going to overtake Britain, would have a larger economy than Britain's by 2024. That didn't happen. The commodity boom died away. There were structural issues. Pensions needed to be reformed. There were vast pensions. People could retire in their 50s in Brazil. The public sector became very bloated. There was a deep recession between 2016 and 2018. The economy has been anemic. There was another blow from COVID since then. And so Brazil lives with this disappointment of what it should have been. So Brazil did not overtake Brazil.
Raised expectations
yes.
about living standards, followed by disappointment.
And that's the irony, because a lot of people were suddenly better off. They could afford cars, they could afford holidays, they could afford to go out for meals. And then they expected more. They wanted good healthcare, they wanted good schools, etc., etc. And all of that didn't happen. So, whether those expectations were unreasonable is another question. But then the second issue that comes along is the biggest corruption scandal, in my mind, in modern human history, and that's Operation Car Wash, Lava Jato, which encompasses 12 countries. But it's kickbacks in Brazil that go to Brazilian politicians for their fundraising campaign, connecting Petrobras and various big Brazilian...
Petrobras is the state oil company.
State oil company. Odebrecht, the construction company. Various companies were wrapped up in this. And that's what ended up with Lula going to prison. And indeed, presidents of other countries. There were 2 Peruvian presidents who were jailed. A third one committed suicide. The tentacles spread to Africa, where the Angolan and Mozambican presidents were also investigated. It was absolutely massive, something that doesn't seem to have perhaps seeped into our consciousness.
Well, as I said,
much.
the British press doesn't spend much time looking at that part of the world.
But it's astonishing. But it caused a collapse in trust of all political parties, because while Lula himself was jailed, and then there were questions about whether that was fair, because again, there were questions about whether he was being politically hounded by his opponent. But all political parties were caught up in this. And so it meant that people lost trust in the Brazilian left, the Workers' Party of Lula, the centre, and the centre-right. And, this is where there are interesting potential parallels with the Conservative Party, because the Conservatives, the PDSB in Brazil, were the natural alternative to the left. They'd held the presidency. They'd been the opposition for a long time. And they've now been wiped out in the last election that they properly stood on. They won 4.5% of the vote. They have one senator in the upper house of parliament. So the right-wing vote moved from the centre to Bolsonaro, and it's still there. So, if you're looking at reform now and the Conservatives, if that's something that augurs, in terms
parallels
of the future,
are striking.
The parallels are striking.
Not?
It's not good news for the Conservatives. That's that's obviously one case study, but there are similarities elsewhere.
It's very similar, isn't it? I mean, all the single issues you spoke about wokery and the economy and so on, combined with, as you said, expectations falling short of reality, and a collapse of trust in institutions, seems to speak to, we can see that in the United States. As you said, we can see it here, we can see it in France, we can see it in Germany. But looking to the future, as you said, he did lose an election. Lula is back in power because he won an election. So despite that big constituency, that alliance that backed Bolsonaro, he lost power. Why, and what do you think the future holds then for Brazil?
Well, I think two big things. So you see where populism runs its course. First of all, he was a COVID skeptic. He believed it was all hyped up by the press, didn't want to take any measures, and Brazilians died in their droves. And so we spoke to people who voted for him the first time round. Second time round, they spoiled their ballots or voted for somebody else, because mostly they said because of his handling of COVID, which was disastrous. There were also then allegations of corruption that were levelled against members of his family. He then tried to sack the police chief. I won't go into all of the details. There were fallouts because of that. So, many of those issues that had confronted Lula confronted Bolsonaro, and he wasn't able to deal with them either. But Brazil remains polarized, and I think those key issues that have always been there, and again, there's a gap between perception and reality. I mean, crime figures have actually fallen a little bit. The Brazilian economy is better than people think it's doing, but nonetheless, those perceptions are still there. But yes, I mean, in terms of what happens next year, Bolsonaro isn't there, but there are potential people he could endorse, Tarcísio de Freitas, the governor of Sao Paulo, or perhaps a member of his family. So I think we're going to see Bolsonarism continue in one shape or form.
That was our senior foreign correspondent, Adrian Blomfield. Coming up, is Russia trying to fix Moldova's election? Welcome back. On Sunday, voters in Moldova, that's the small former Soviet republic between Romania and Ukraine, will cast their votes in a parliamentary election. And it's being contested not only by Moldovan politicians, but the world's great powers. Maya Sandu, the president, has accused Russia of spending millions on disinformation campaigns, vote-buying operations, and even preparing for an armed insurgency to wrest power from her pro-European incumbent PAS party and hand it to pro-Russian left-wing rivals. Some 74 people were arrested this week on suspicion of planning post-election violence. So what do Moldovans want out of their next election? And why are the stakes so high for both Russia and the West? I spoke to Andrei Curăraru, the founder of Watchdog MD, a Chisinau-based think tank that has been tracking what it says is an extensive Russian influence campaign directed at swaying the outcome. I started by asking him just why this election is so hotly contested.
I think there are two levels where we can talk about the high stakes that this election has. The first one, and maybe the more obvious one, is that EU has a very open policy towards Moldova. We see leaders of EU countries coming to Moldova, Germany, France, Poland, Romania, even the leaders of the whole of the European Union come to join Moldova on a EU-Moldova summit. We have a very narrow window of trying to get into the European Union until 2028, 2029. Afterwards, a EU parliamentary election could change the mood in Brussels about Moldova, or disrupt any process that Moldova has already in place. There are strong geopolitical arguments for Moldova to join. For sure, we are not ready economically yet, but we've seen decisions taking place within the European Union of letting people in, then allowing for continued reforms to happen. For example, our neighbor Romania was monitored for 17 years on rule of law. And the next element is the Russian interest on Moldova as a factor in its greater aggression on the European continent. It's clear that Putin has this image of the USSR getting back together, or maybe even a larger imperialist project that he wants to implement. Moldova is a cog, a small one at that, but a cog that can be important for his war in Ukraine. There are more and more talks about using Transnistria, the breakaway region in the east of the country, to put pressure on Ukraine to threaten the Odessa region and to draw the attention of the Ukrainian army, to draw valuable troops that could be used elsewhere on the front, and to make Moldova from a logistical hub that helps Ukraine with different types of foodstuff, delivery of fuel and so on, in a Russian control zone that can be a source of instability and can be even a source of diversions, incursions, and so on. Making its plan and those maps that we've seen in the recent time on the walls of the Russian military of conquering both Kherson and Odessa region more palpable and clearer to the view. It could also be a important element for Russia to have this stronghold in Moldova to influence larger European processes. We have 1.5 million of people who have Romanian passports, EU passports at that, and that could be a pressure point on Romanian politics, on greater European politics, influencing decisions within the European Parliament, Council of Europe, where Russia is not present anymore, spreading its narratives and so on. But for the simple folk of Moldova, it's a yet another chance at deciding whether we go westwards or go back eastwards to a to some a nostalgical option linked to the youth in the USSR, or greater security for their linguistic rights, if we are talking about Russian speakers here in Moldova.
There you have it. It's a kind of a tension between west-leaning and east-leaning Moldova, I suppose, plus Russia's ambitions there. And where does Vladimir Plahotniuk, forgive my pronunciation.
It's actually perfect.
Was it?
Yeah.
Well, there we are, Vladimir Plahotniuk. This is the tycoon, oligarch, if you like, who was just extradited just the other day back to Moldova to face charges related to a $1 billion bank fraud, dubbed the theft of the century. Tell us about him and the significance of the fact that he has finally been extradited and returned to Moldova to face trial.
Vlad Plahotniuk was basically the person who was running things in Moldova for decades, first from the shadow of the communist regime, being in a way the bagman of Vladimir Voronin, the then president of the Republic of Moldova. Afterwards, gaining more and more of a political stature on his own. He basically controlled the state, and that allowed him to access the banking system. He laundered money for the Russians, then started stealing money from the biggest banks in Moldova, causing basically a situation where the banking system would crash. The state had to intervene to guarantee those loans that he undertook under false pretenses. And basically now the people of Moldova have to pay up the $1 billion that he stole. He was basically running one party in Moldova, controlling the then Prime Minister Vlad Filat, who was also convicted of the $1 billion theft in his time. He's your big bad wolf of Moldova, who escaped the country after trying to annul some elections that didn't go his way, and has been a fugitive for 6 years. He still has connections in the Moldovan political spectrum. He was famous for his compromat dossiers, filming politicians in indecent contexts, taping offers of bribes. There's a famous tape where he offers a bag full of, according to different sources, up to 850,000 euro to the then president of Moldova, Igor Dodon. He is a big factor, but now not as big as he was before in the Moldovan politics. Getting him back from Greece, where he lived under a false identity, he had more than 20 passports, is a big win for Moldova. But our justice system is not as clean as it should be for a European country, and we have great fears that he might still get off scot-free and try to insert himself back into Moldovan politics and economics. He actually, there are talks that he wanted to come back to Moldova to restart his political project, but it was thwarted by the Interpol and Greek authorities. He has people who worked with him in different political parties that are now running, especially in the Alternativa bloc, the Technocrats bloc, and I think he is a factor that is influencing the election, but not as much as another oligarch who now resides in Moscow, Ilan Shor, who is basically the man behind the bribing system that is happening in Moldova, and that is the biggest threat to Moldovan democracy. He managed to bribe around 10% of the population that voted in the presidential election, and he's trying to do it again and to organize those violent protests in the aftermath of the election if things don't go his way.
We should probably say for legal reasons that Mr. Platnyuk has not yet been convicted, and he says the charges that you described are politically motivated. Tell me about then. Just so you've articulated very well the sides in this election, why the stakes are so high, for pro-European Moldovans, why they're so high for Russia. In fact, could you tell us a little bit about these mechanisms of interference, and I suppose particularly what you just referred to there, the buying of votes? I suppose in richer democracies that sounds a little bit strange, that you could just literally pay people to vote one way or another. How widespread is this, and is it expected to happen again this time round?
Yeah, vote buying, I would say, is one of the biggest threats because it weaponizes poverty, a big issue in the Republic of Moldova. The sums that people are getting vary from 20 euros to upwards of 100 euros per vote. But that's just one part of the hybrid warfare that is being run against our country. Disinformation is another big part. Independent journalists have established that there is a army of at least 1,500 people who have multiple accounts and post daily coordinated fake news in order to exploit the algorithms of the social networks. There are influencers that are being paid to spread the same type of narratives. There are at least 6 TV stations that are doing the same, including one that is run directly from Moscow and does 24 hours political coverage of Moldova and is run online only because they lost their license to activate in Moldova. There are many other elements of it. One that is particularly interesting and new to Moldova is the use of the church. We have a Russian-leaning Orthodox church in Moldova that covers basically 80% of the communities in Moldova, where they basically insert anti-EU, anti-government messages in their sermons. They have been sent to so-called pilgrimages in Moscow last year. Now they have gotten smarter and are sending the same priests to Serbia, to Israel, to Turkey. Also, according to different leaks that we've seen in the public space, they're getting around 1,000 euros per month to do the Russians beating back here. They have a ecosystem of Telegram channels and a newspaper, 200,000 copies of which were lifted the day before yesterday, where they basically said that you need to vote against this government if you are to save your own church. This is quite a powerful message to active churchgoers and especially the elderly, and it influences a chunk of the population of Moldova. And there are greater geopolitical elements to it. They organized a artificial energy crisis in the Transnistrian region, so people would vote for Russian parties on the right bank. There are 90% of the people living there have Moldovan passports.
Okay, so this is an important point, actually. So the people who live in Transnistria, which is a breakaway state that's been quasi-independent since a war, 30 years ago now, they can vote in Moldova.
Yeah, most of them have both Moldovan and Ukrainian passports. Some of them have Russian passports as well. They have been issuing them especially for social benefits to get a second pension from the Russian state or the Moldovan state. And usually around 25,000 people vote from the Transnistrian side. We expect more organization and more people to come and vote for the pro-Russian parties. And we are seeing the propaganda in the region saying that people should do that because that way they could get out of this energy crisis that is going on since January this year.
Andrei, thank you for painting this picture. I suppose the big question is, well, we'll find out what happens on Sunday or maybe on Monday morning. What are the opinion polls saying? Is your feeling that the incumbent pro-European faction is likely to prevail here? Or does it look like those other parties you listed, some of them leaning towards Moscow, have a chance of seizing a majority in parliament?
Well, the way that the last polls are showing the situation to be is that it would be very hard for the ruling party to form a government by itself. It heavily relies on diaspora that cannot be polled because they're located in so many countries. And if the diaspora is mobilized quite heavily, it could result in a slim majority for the ruling party, but the most likely outcome is that the ruling party will have to look for partners in a coalition. That would be most likely the populist party or the Alternativa bloc, the so-called technocrats, and that could create some rifts and problems afterwards. A coalition that is not based on values rarely functions for a lot of time, so if that happens, we are expecting a government breakdown and maybe repeated elections.
That was Andrei Curăraru, the founder of Watchdog MD. The Moldovan election is on Sunday. We will be back on Monday, so tune in and we may be able to bring you the results. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph created by David Knowles. If you appreciated this show, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review as it helps others find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to the Telegraph, sign on to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine, for latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. This episode of Battle Lines was hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and produced by Max Bauer. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.